European Parliament is discussing about the Horizon 2020.
Yes.
And you just made a speech about the industrial and social economic consequences of this policy. And some colleagues respond to you that you had to take in consideration the victims of extreme weather events. What did you answer? What could we answer to those people?
Well, I was dealing with the issue that the Horizon 2020 program wants to address, amongst other things, what they call societal challenges, and they specifically mention climate change as part of that. So my speech focused on the impact of our climate policies, which more and more people are realizing are doing huge damage in terms of forcing up energy prices, driving households and pensioners into fuel poverty, but also undermining our economy and our competitiveness and forcing businesses to move abroad, taking their jobs and their investment with them. But one colleague, a Green MEP, Mr. Claude Termez, used the so-called blue card procedure to put a question to me. I agreed to accept his question. In fact, it wasn't a question, it was a statement. He said I should be ashamed of myself because it was climate change that was causing weather disasters, as, for example, the recent problem in Sardinia, in which, sadly, a number of people died. In my response, I said that perhaps he would also blame climate change for the 1900 Galveston hurricane, in which several thousand people died, or perhaps in my country, the Linton-Lymouth flood disaster in 1952. There have always been natural disasters. There is no evidence that typhoons or hurricane activity are increased recently as a result of changes in climate. So it really is just desperation on the part of these people that they recognize that the world isn't getting any warmer and hasn't been for the best part of 20 years. So they're looking for some other hook to hang their alarmism on. But what I thought was really interesting, when we had finished this exchange, an Italian colleague in the chamber came across to me and said, actually, it wasn't climate change that caused the Sardinia disaster. It was actually the European Stability Pact, which has denied the money to the local government in Sardinia that it needs to dredge the river. So we're not looking at a disaster that results from climate change. We're looking at a disaster that results from inadequate funding to keep the river clear and prevent flooding. And that results from European policy and ultimately, of course, from the euro currency, which is doing huge damage across southern Europe.
But what can we answer to the scientists who say that in the next years, in the next decades, these extreme weather events will increase if nothing is done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, what we say is this, that the whole of climate alarmism is based on forecasts. They tell us the world will get warmer. It's increased by less than 1 degree in 100 years, and in the last 17 years, global temperatures haven't increased at all. So it's all predictions. They tell us that sea level will rise at an alarming rate. But right now it's not rising at an alarming rate. It's rising at roughly the rate it's been rising at for the last 500 years. So all these things are predictions and models and forecasts. What we should do is stop looking at predictions and models and forecasts, which are to a large extent politically driven, and look instead at the real data in the real world. And when we look at that, we find there is nothing to be alarmed about.
So I guess that you still critique strongly the fact that at least 20% of the EU budget, the long-term EU budget, will be devoted to climate change-related policy.
Well, the 20% of the research budget, yes, I'm very sorry about that. But that is peanuts compared to the vast amount of money that we're wasting on renewable energy that doesn't deliver, can't be relied on. It merely exports inefficiency to its fossil fuel backup. That is what is doing vast economic damage, and as I said, we are choosing poverty for our children and our grandchildren in pursuit of a climate policy that cannot deliver while the rest of the world is building coal-fired power stations.
These days, governments of the world have an important conference in Warsaw on climate change, trying to find ways to limit so-called global warming.
Yes.
Do you think they live in a huge lie?
Well, I shall be speaking about that tomorrow in the plenary. But the news we're getting from Warsaw is that, first of all, the Japanese have simply abandoned the commitments they made on emissions reduction targets. Australia has said no more money for these projects. Canada has congratulated Australia. The Americans have absolutely refused to countenance any kind of compensation to developing countries from industrialized countries. It looks to me as though we're going to get the same thing from this conference that we got from the previous ones: a lot of hot air, lots of people flying around in jet aircraft, but no serious commitments, no serious difference. The people are simply not prepared to pay for the dreams of these politicians like Claude Turmes.
In order to be concrete for citizens, how could you explain the link, maybe by example, between the amount on the bill of the energy prices and the European policies? How it's linked?
Well, this is a matter of dispute. I wrote this in an article recently, and somebody in a comment said, oh, just look at this website. But it's much more complicated than that. It's the specific green charges and subsidies, but then it is contingent effects. It's what's happening because we didn't do that. It's also choices of fuel. For example, we could be building coal-fired power stations in Britain. Coal is cheap. At the moment, American coal is very cheap. We don't do that because the government is terrified of the Greens. So it's European policy on climate and emissions and green pressure groups who are preventing us from using cheaper fossil fuels. So you've got a double whammy. You've got the cost of renewables, which are virtually useless, and you've got the high cost of fossil fuels because people want us to use imported gas. They don't want us to use coal.